right, we are at 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Oh, but for one more person, this would be one already and we can start. How's everyone doing? So while we were waiting for other people to roll in. Doing okay? Cool. How's life otherwise, just generally? Good. Anything interesting happening in the world?
My dad's coming to visit me.
Oh, wonderful. Where's he coming from?
Key West.
Key West, okay. When did you last see him?
Summer.
Okay. Any plans for what you guys are going to do? Ride the trolley. Wait, there's a trolley in St. Pete. There's a trolley here too, down?
Yeah, it goes from downtown Tampa to Ybor City.
Okay, right. Okay. Cool. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 22. All right. So we have quorum. Let's get started. Welcome back to everybody to today's class. Thank you again for a very lively discussion last time. I quite enjoyed it. Though perhaps I got a little too excited. Did I get too excited?
I thought it was more fun when you got more excited.
Sure. Yeah, it's more fun than I was excited. You're recording, I say things, I show things on the screen. I was wearing a somebody's muting for some reason. The reason why I'm muted constantly? I wanted to go to the funeral for my colleague, but I couldn't, and I just seen the online version of the funeral, and I think I was to compensate for the way I was feeling by getting too excited on this other end. But I think it made for an exciting conversation. I quite enjoyed the back and forth. I hope there is some more of that today. I have a few bureaucratic announcements. Somebody's speaking with us. I have a few bureaucratic announcements. I'm still grading your papers, so hopefully it will be done by this weekend. We'll have them, I'll release them. We should have them soon. Number one, number two, I think most likely I'm tending towards not having class on Wednesday next week, just because from past experience, a lot of people didn't show up, and it's just bizarre to be just talking to a room full of blank screens. That was my experience in the past. Even that one time when we had to stop class and take it online for that week. I mean, that's not a pleasant experience teaching this class remotely. But what I will do is I will upload a reading, which we will address when we come back from spring break. So the last week of classes, we will have classes. In December, I think it's December, the last days of November and the first couple of days of December. Sorry, what am I saying? Last couple of days of November and a couple of days of December, the last week of class, we will have a reading for that week, and I will upload it to Canvas shortly. And I think it's a very powerful reading. It's about contemporary politics in a way, and so I think it should elicit your interest in some fashion, I hope. All right, we are at 21, 22, 23, 24. All right, people who Shomik couldn't make it today. Shomik is not feeling well, but he is online. If you have any questions, please do address it to him separately, but he couldn't be here. Sorry about that. Okay, what was our first recap? Sorry, the first bureaucratic announcement. Done. Any comments, questions, or concerns about that you want to raise about stuff so far? Okay, so last time we talked about, this is the challenge that I said Thoreau places before us. He tells us that between our conscience and our desire for convenience or expediency, we can only choose one. And most people, most of the times, because they're afraid of what the state will do to them, the way in which it'll punish their senses, give up their sensibility, give up their conscience, and choose the path of experience. And I think whether or not there are other alternatives, whether the alternative of choosing our, our conscience over our convenience, whether it delivers something useful to us or not, regardless of these other questions, which are of course very important, I think the power of Thoreau is that he points out to a certain hypocrisy. Right? If at the very least, the hypocrisy of wanting to sound like someone who has all the right opinions without having to take the risk of acting on them. We certainly, I know for myself, I certainly do that with the crowds in which I hang out. I want to be considered as part of the in crowd, so I mouth the right things, say the right things. But in moments of action, I say, I don't think I want to do that. I want to step away. And Thoreau also acknowledges that. And he says, look, at the very least, what you should do, if you can't actually become a tool of the state, even if you're not a tool of the state, if you're just an average person trying to have an average life, you should at least withdraw your consent from that state by refusing to do your taxes. Don't become a part of the problem. And there are also all these ways in which would we have a separate tax for the military? Would we have a separate tax for all the things that we don't like, and a separate tax for the things we do like? How would that function? These are all problems that are problems of convenience, solving the problem from a technical sense. The moral problem they present, however, Thoreau would say, is crystal clear. And it's, it says something about us as human beings when we choose to muddle the matters that Thoreau so clearly presents for us. It was in light of what Thoreau was saying, where we sort of say the right things, but are not often willing to act on it, that I thought about my experiment that I offered to you last time as something that we did partake of together. I'm not telling you to do it, I was inviting you to do it. How many people agreed that they were not going to eat any animal products between Monday until, however, let's say till next Monday when we're reading Gandhi? 1, 2, 3, 4 people in this room. Any people online? Nobody online offered it? I don't think that's true. I think some people did say yes. Spencer says he lasted 1 meal. Okay, Spencer, thank you. But you did try. Anybody else? 4 people. How's it going?
A struggle.
A struggle?
Oh my God, a struggle.
What was the struggle like?
I mean, the meat part isn't hard at all. It's the animal byproducts like the milk and the eggs.
Right.
That's a struggle.
What does it feel like? When do you feel the struggle?
Well, it's it's both in terms of convenience and also in terms of not practicality, but like
Convenience.
everything that we cook in our household has usually meat, and if it doesn't have meat, it at least has milk or cream or
Who's cooking?
eggs. Usually my sister,
Okay.
my sister and my brother. But so that's just kind of a little difficult in terms of like, what am I gonna eat?
Sure.
And then the other thing is just in terms of like convenience. For example, my favorite beverage is eggnog, and that finally just came out. And they just bought it from the grocery store on Monday. And so I get home, and every time that I open the fridge, I'm just staring at the carton of eggnog that I desperately want to drink, but I can't. Yeah.
I believe the phrase, the struggle is real.
Struggle is
Is
real.
real. Other people who said we were going to do it. Simon, how's it going?
It went pretty well. I slipped up one time.
Oh, too late. Failed.
It was a bite. I took a bite out of a cookie that I made, and I was like, oh wait, it has an egg in it.
Okay.
So I just gave it to my sister.
Okay.
But my mom also, she like cooks with yogurt a lot.
All right.
So the whole time I was just eating like rice on like cooking.
Do you have to explain to your mom why you were doing this to yourself? Why you're insulting her cooking by refusing to eat it?
She was really supportive about it. She was like, yeah, you could do it. And then my dad was just making fun of me because I had to miss out on my mom's cooking.
Right.
So yeah, it was just a lot of ridicule for the past 3 days.
Sure, and then there's like, you see, all you get to taste, all this food that other people are eating, which you can taste it in your mind's eye,
Yeah.
but you can't actually taste it, and so you're like, what am I doing this for again?
It's weirder because I had to be more conscious about what I ate. Like
Sure.
I constantly had to check what I was eating.
Right,
So
right,
that was the hardest part.
sure. Andrew?
It's been pretty easy so far, but so far,
Sure.
because I have to go grocery shopping later, so that's definitely gonna be a bit more difficult. Mostly, it's just been, like doing like what Belly and Summa said, is just checking for animal byproducts and stuff like that. Like I had to check if this like energy drink I got had like, some sort of animal product in it before I bought it and stuff like that. But pretty much since like my fridge has been completely empty for the past couple days, it's just I've just been going out and getting like a salad or something. So it's been kind of convenient in that sense. I did some nice dish with, I think it was like tahini, chickpeas, and jalapenos yesterday. I pulled some like recipe off of Bon Appetit that was pretty good. And so
That's interesting already. Like, Mario, I'll come to you in 1 second. But maybe, okay, why don't you tell us?
What?
What's your experience been like so far?
I lost.
You know, it doesn't matter. But tell us how you lost. What happened?
I had a strawberry milkshake.
Okay.
The strawberry milkshake in the vending machine in the ISA building is very good. And I forgot that I was even taking this class or that we said that we are not doing that. So on Monday I may have had strawberry.
So right after class, you had a strawberry milkshake.
It was a few hours. It was enough time for me to reasonably forget.
Okay, but then did you didn't try to climb back on that?
Well, because I have changed the way I eat completely like the last few months. So that's why that would be easy because I have been eating like vegan basically.
Sure.
With the exception of chicken, so I just didn't have chicken, but I have like, you can have like meat. It's actually easy. That's why I was all like, it'll be easy for you to try. If you have like meatless, you can have like meatless beef, meatless chicken nuggets, all that. If you get an air fryer, put it in the air fryer, and you're good with some ketchup. But yeah, so that's what I don't consume.
Okay. But tell me what happened in that moment when you had the strawberry milkshake. What happened in that moment?
So good.
Help me think through the process of how you ended up wanting a strawberry milkshake and buying it and drinking it and then remembering it.
Oh, okay, okay. So I had to stay on campus to study,
Okay,
and I didn't have anything to eat. So I was like, I really need something. And there's nothing in the vending machine that you can eat that's like good for you. And I'm also like really looking at what I eat very closely.
is the strawberry milkshake good for you?
That one is very good for you. It is actually
It
good.
is good for you? Okay, not full of sugars?
Protein shake. It's like a protein.
Okay,
strawberry milkshake.
sure.
So it's like, I guess I did choose convenience because I was like, I have to drink something that's filling right now so I can focus on this LSAT or whatever.
Patrick, I thought you also raised your hand. You were gonna,
No, I mean, I would, but like, just with the way that our economy isn't really based around this sort of thing, so a lot of the cheaper stuff is.
sure, no, absolutely, right.
So convenience, yeah, I wasn't able.
Or you cook for yourself. You just, go and buy some lentils and rice and then, you have to like have all the stuff that you have to cook, or chickpeas and hummus and all this other stuff that sort of costs more money. Okay, so a couple of things. So that, yes, Ariana.
Are you doing this as well?
Oh, no.
Are you actually not?
No,
Why not?
you know what I eat? Honestly, what I eat?
Chicken nuggets.
Not yet. She's not there yet. I'm dreading the moment when she gets there. She's in the stage right now where when she's done with something, like she doesn't want it anymore, she flings it over the edge. I'm literally the dog in the house. Whatever we gave her, she didn't eat, she flung. I'm like, okay, all right, okay. So I gave her some chicken sausages and I was like, so no, I did not do it. I failed. And important reason that I want to connect to what Belly and Sama said. But Sama, go ahead.
I was gonna say, when my dad was asking me why I was doing it, I was like explaining it's for my class. And he was like, is your professor doing it? I was like defending you. I was like, yeah, he's totally gonna do it.
Of course.
Like, this is a solidarity movement.
It's an experiment. It's just an experiment. It's an invitation. Thank you so much. I mean, I feel like you wasted your efforts to defend me on the wrong subject, but I'll take it. No, okay. So but let's think about this, right? We, as Patrick said, we are embedded within structures that make some choices easier than others. In Patrick's case, he said, I mean, absolutely, this is one of the biggest reasons why people don't eat, for example, healthier food, because that healthier food is more expensive, the way in which we've constructed our economies, our supply chains, etc. So the structures in which we're embedded make our choices difficult. Sometimes the structures are economic and political, sometimes the structures are traditional and based on familial obligations. I'm sure if you kept this up summer for some time, I mean, if your mom is anything like my mom, at some level, you will start getting some degrees of guilt thrown at you for why you're denying my food. I worked so hard to cook this for you, how can you not eat this? Right? There are all these ways in which the demands of the world will pull us in its direction. And we will, at some point, give in. Right? Makes sense. I understand. I gave in like Tuesday morning. It was very easy for me. And yes, Brian.
You said, the end of the world, but then I'm kind of thinking, like, do you think it's like, also like, in the lens of America? Like, do you think it's all true, it's true worldwide, or maybe like?
I think it's true worldwide, I mean,
But I think world wars, yeah.
well, I mean, in terms of carbon footprints, like, yes, the US is the one we think from that perspective. But the idea that there's something about, choosing convenience over ethics, like, I mean, that is true for everybody everywhere. That the impact of that is very different here. But like, I mean, what I meant by the demand of the world was, for example, like the LSAT, right? Like, I can understand the money thing very easily. I can understand the family thing very easily. I can understand the LSAT thing, but it requires me to understand something more about you and say, okay, Maria wants to do well on her LSAT because she wants to go to a good law school. She wants to do well, maybe professionally for reasons of finance, reasons of ethics, whatever. But somehow she sees the LSAT as a means to the end, the milkshake as a means to the end towards being able to study for the LSAT. And therefore, a series of choices, series of ethical choices, are put aside and become means to some larger end. But what that end is and who decides what that end is sometimes completely out of our control. And what I want to do with Gandhi is I want to think about how he's trying to make the ends that we choose objects of conscious deliberation. Because if everything becomes a means to an end, then the distinction between means and ends collapses. Everything is permissible for some end. But why we chose that end, how we found ourselves attached to that end, we oftentimes we don't even get the breathing space to ask. Like, I didn't get the breathing space to ask, why am I eating my daughter's discarded food? I know I was eating my daughter's discarded food because I cooked it for her. She was throwing it off the edge. I felt very bad about the fact that I'd cooked all this food and she wasn't eating it. And rather than having it be wasted, I said I would eat it up rather than throwing it in the trash. Why did I do that? I don't know. But somehow that thing made sense to me in that context of that moment. Just as in the moments in which you failed or will fail, the choices before you will make more sense in compared to the larger abstract end of being ethical towards animals. And so maybe in that sense, what Patrick was saying, what Mercedes was saying last time, that we need to have structural responses, will be something that Gandhi will take up more seriously in a way that Thoreau himself cannot. Funny story about Thoreau, I should tell you this. I think what Thoreau is saying is very important, but I do want to tell you this. When Thoreau was living in Walden Pond, you guys know about this? Okay, so he wrote this book called Walden. It's a series of essays. Thoreau did, not Gandhi, Thoreau. And it's a beautiful essay where he talks about sort of living off the grid, more or less, and living by himself and doing everything by himself. And it's the very model for a kind of self-reliant existence. If you go to Concord, Massachusetts, and you go to Walden Pond, you will get tours of everything that Thoreau saw and experienced. It's magisterial literature that is America's contribution, amongst one of many, to the world. Funny story about this paragon of self-reliance. His mom did his laundry and did his cooking while he was there, while he was being quote-unquote self-reliant. It's just as Ralph Waldo Emerson, while writing about self-reliant, was living off the very vast fortune of his wife, who he had married after she had been widowed because she was married to some rich dude. So maybe in some ways these very rich people were talking about self-reliance, or we're talking about, being civil disobedience, when in fact they had a whole structure behind them to protect them and to guard them and to lift them up. Gandhi takes from these guys some basic ideas, but I think he connects it to a politics of the poor, politics of kind of social movement from the ground up that tries to reimagine the ends for which the independent movement in India, or in fact anywhere else, was fighting. And I think for that reason, he's very, very interesting. Let me say a little bit about Gandhi, his life and times. We all seem to know Gandhi in a way. We all just as we all seem to know Martin Luther King Jr. When in fact there is a lot to still learn about him. So Gandhi was born in India, and he in 1869, and in India at this point was a British colony. He was born in a small principality somewhere, which, like all principalities in India at the time, paid taxes to the British. He was sent to England to become a lawyer, and he went to England, and there he was transformed. Because for the first time, in a way that he had never thought to do so before, he encountered his own culture, but from the perspective of someone living away from it, and was therefore able to develop a very interesting relationship to it. He becomes a vegetarian. He already was a vegetarian, but now he connects with other vegetarians. He becomes a lifelong vegetarian. And he comes back to India to practice law. He's not able to get any real job, and is instead sent to South Africa, or goes to South Africa, where there's a large Indian population, to serve their economic interests by being a lawyer representing them in the British courts in South Africa. And South Africa at this point also is a colonial settlement, far more racist than the one in India, but nevertheless also ruled by the British for the most part. In a famous story, anyone seen the movie Gandhi with Ben Kingsley? Pretty good movie, you should check it out. Really good movie. It won him the Oscar in '82 when it came out. The scene is very powerfully dramatized in it, and Gandhi himself makes much hay of it. He lands in South Africa, and he has to take a train to the place where he's supposed to meet the clients who are going to hire him. And so he buys it as he's dressed nattily, like a English Victorian gentleman, or Edwardian at that point, I suppose. And he's wearing a three-piece suit and a tie and a top hat and a cane and whatever. And he buys himself a first-class ticket to travel from where he lands to where he has to go. I forget what this, Johannesburg to Durban or Transvaal to something else. I don't know. And along the way, the train conductor comes in and asks him what he's doing in this first-class cabin. And he says, I have a ticket to the first-class cabin. And he's like, yeah, but what are you doing here? He's like, I bought a ticket to the first-class cabin. He's like, don't you know that coloreds are not allowed? That's what they're called, are not allowed in the first-class cabin. And he's like, how dare you, sir? I'm a subject of the British Empire, of Her Majesty's government, have the same subject rights as you do. How dare you treat me in this way? And then the guy says, shut the whatever up. And at the next train station, he tosses Gandhi and his luggage off the train. And for Gandhi, this was like a transformative experience. Because it's one thing to be a subject in India and not experience racism. It's another thing to go to England and become, for the most part, like if you went to, if you guys went to New York, for instance, New York is a place where you become anonymous. In London, you become anonymous. It's another thing to think that you have been armed with all the education, all the titles that the British Empire has to bestow upon you, to then go to an outpost of the British Empire and be told, for all the training you had, for all the lawyerly sort of credentials you claim to have, ultimately you're still a man of color and therefore do not belong in the first-class cabins. That is quite the shattering experience. It certainly shatters your illusions in some ways. And for Gandhi, this is a transformative experience insofar as he realizes that, there is something to struggle for here. What that struggle is initially is for him, having the same self-respect or being accorded the same respect as every other British subject. And that's what he thinks he deserves. And while he is in South Africa, he becomes aware of policies that the British government is applying in South Africa in order to manage their control over South African society, amongst which is a series of racist laws designed to limit immigration from India into South Africa. I won't go into the specifics of it, but in response to these racist laws, Gandhi tries to figure out, well, how do I fight this? And he's read Thoreau, he's read Emerson, he has read, those of you familiar with him, Leon Tolstoy, not the War and Peace Leon Tolstoy, same Leon Tolstoy, but not War and Peace, but his essays on passive resistance. And Gandhi says, that seems to work. I want to develop that strategy and apply it here. So basically, he refuses. So one of the things that the British government wants all Indians to do is to pay to get a special ID card. Now, you have to get the ID card, otherwise you'll be kicked out of the country. You have to pay to get the ID card, but the price of the ID card is an enormous amount. It's understood that most people won't be able to pay, so most people will be found in violation of that ID card, so therefore they can be kicked out of the country. Gandhi refuses to get the ID card. And with those who have ID cards, they actively burn their ID cards in a fire, thereby courting the displeasure of the authorities. And he's arrested and he's thrown in jail. And this happens to him again and again and again. And he realizes that what he's doing in that moment, the strategy that he's developing, cannot be called passive resistance. There's nothing passive about what he's doing. It's very active. He's throwing himself out into the world and alongside others, inviting the displeasure of the government to contest illegitimate laws, or laws that they feel are illegitimate. And he says, you know what? We need a new name for this. We need a new way of thinking about this. And he's a very good organizer in terms of having. This was Gandhi's talent, was to have newspapers and communal farms and this and that in order to sort of sustain this way of life. He has a little contest in one of his newspapers inviting people to come up with a name for this thing that they're doing. And the name they come up with is Satyagraha, which he says is not passive resistance. Instead, Satyagraha is a firm insistence on the truth. So this part of the word means truth, and this part of the word means grasp. If translated literally. And he says, that's what we're doing. We are firmly insisting on the truth that our position has moral substance. And I think that move is pretty transformative, because now Gandhi creates a system of resistance that he's then able to move later on in his life to India, where it becomes, in a couple of instances that occur well after the writing of this book, Hind Swaraj, which I'll get to in a moment, it becomes, in a few celebrated cases, it becomes sort of a mechanism by which forces that were deemed unmovable, unshakable, when faced with the satyagraha of poor people, were basically forced to give way. And it catapulted Gandhi into the national consciousness, and he basically, one of his greatest achievements was to bring the mass of poor people who were completely ignored by the political parties of the time, to bring them into the independence movement, to make them active participants in their own liberation. And in that process, he sort of, introduced an overwhelming force into Indian politics that the British could not resist. And so we won't go into the whole bunch of things that Gandhi did, but basically, in effect, most people agree that Gandhi was hugely responsible for gaining independence for India. But also, as we know, and I'm sure you know, this model of satyagraha becomes basically a device that then travels to different parts of the world, including becomes hugely influential in the US when it's taken up very consciously by Martin Luther King Jr., who was introduced to Gandhi's writings in the 40s or early 50s, who basically applies this concept to the American civil rights movement. Takes on a lot of the stuff that Gandhi is talking about and sort of makes it part of his strategy and his the basis for his politics. The basis of this politics is by insisting on the truth, you morally transform your oppressor. Right? It's meant to do that. The sight of British soldiers bludgeoning Indians on the head, or racist policemen in Alabama, or attack dogs biting children in the streets is meant to transform the hardened hearts of neutral observers and make them come out onto the streets against the brutality that they're witnessing. Anyway, so Gandhi's influence is quite significant. He's one of, those people whose names you can just sort of just Gandhi, and most people will know who I'm talking about. Now, the context of Hind Swaraj, the book that we're reading, is interesting. So the term Hind Swaraj, as I'm sure you would have noticed by now, it means Indian self-rule. So we'll be focusing a lot on this word in the context of self-rule, or if you want to use the Emersonian language, self-reliance. So this book is about Indian self-rule. Now, when Gandhi is in India, he is asked to travel to Britain a couple of times to deliver petitions on behalf of Indians living in South Africa to the British government. The idea, so this is politics by writing petitions. And so he goes to England with a bunch of petitions, and he meets some pretty high-ranking British officials who make all the right noises, but of course they don't do anything in terms of substantively changing the nature of their rule in South Africa. But while Gandhi is there, he's come back to England after a long time, he meets a lot of the other Indians who are there. A lot of the other Indians who have been revolutionized, who have been radicalized by anti-colonial politics. And so these guys basically tell Gandhi, look around you. Look around you circa 1909. One of the most transformative events that has happened in world politics happened in 1905. Does anybody know what happened in 1905? An anti-colonial perspective?
The Ottoman Empire?
No?
That's later,
Later, sorry.
about 15 years later.
Sorry.
No, never mind. I think that was 1880 or something.
Is that when he issued an official apology for the incredible violence and crimes that he did in one of the African colonies?
In 1905?
I wasn't sure. If the date-
No, I doubt 1905.
It was in the early 1900s, and I think it was before World War I.
Andrew, did you look?
I'm trying to look it up, and it's talking about some sort of relating to India, but it's not naming a specific thing.
Oh, no, what happened was not related to India. No.
No, that was.
The
Doesn't matter. I don't know why I'm testing you guys. I'll just tell you. It was the Russo-Japanese War.
Oh, what?
oh.
Bro, I was gonna say that. Now I'm mad at myself.
Russo-Japanese War, right? So there's a war between Russia and Japan, in the imagination of the people who are fighting it, or the people who are observing it, between a civilized European nation and a barbaric backward people of Asia. And in the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese win. I like telling the story because it's just funny, but So this is the map of Europe for those who can make out. Can you make out?
See Spain.
Oh, yeah. Or, well, no, that's about Europe. Europe, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Japan. This is Japan. So the funny story, the Russians had 3 fleets. They had a fleet here, that was a warm water fleet, so it had to be summertime, otherwise it was frozen. They had a fleet in the Black Sea, but they needed the permission of all the other European countries to be able to travel through it. So they were denied authority. And they had a fleet over here in, or wherever
Vladivostok.
Vladivostok is. And that's the only ones they could send out, and they were promptly sunk. But they did send out, when the water was warm, they did send out these guys, this is England over here, who when they were so drunk, when they reached England, they saw some fishermen, and they started firing at them, thinking they had reached Japan, almost caused an international incident. When, woo, don't forget Madagascar, woo.
Did they make the Suez by this point?
No, they didn't.
Okay, okay.
And by the time they reached there, they were properly sunk again, because there was nothing left for them to really fight for. Anyway, the point is, this was so transformative, by the way, for those of you, any international relations people here? The start of international relations in America as a discipline begins in this moment. How to deal with the savage peoples of the colonized world and how they will overwhelm us. We must have a study of international relations that will help us stem this tide. An actual thing that was said. Anyone read Foreign Affairs, the venerable Foreign Affairs magazine?
Once, twice. I mean, it's awful, but I read it.
Do you know what it's called in the beginning?
I do not.
Let's find out. I mean, I know what it is, but I just want to get the title right. Foreign Affairs magazine. It was called, I don't want to go to your website, I want to go to the Wikipedia website for once. It'll tell me the truth, I think.
Journal of International Relations.
No. Oh, that would be nice. No. Journal of Race Development.
Oh, I see that now, yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. It's amazing the world we live in, right? Beautiful, what a wonderful world. And the history behind it and things that happened before that shape the way things happen later and then they're happening now. Amazing how things work. Anyway, so yeah, this is a transformative event. Certainly the Europeans are shook by this. What else is happening in the world? The Americans are shook by this. They start the Journal of Race Relations a few years later. Race development. But for a lot of the people in the colonized world, this is also a transformative moment. Because what it tells them is that given the right sorts of things in place, they have the power to beat the colonizers. The colonizers have been telling them that they're so much more superior to them because they have all of these things. Guns, germs, and steel, if you want to use that expression. So, these people that Gandhi meets in England, these other Indians, they are radicalized by this. They're like, we want to do the same thing. We want to do for India what the Japanese did for them, and what Mazzini I should have made Italy much better, what the Italians are doing. Italians were not considered a major European country, they're still not considered a major European country, I suppose, except in football, soccer, all the apologies to the Italians. But back in the day, they were considered sort of, Southern Europe was a backwater. So the Italians have revolutionized and have, and under Mazzini and Garibaldi. Let's do that. Let's bring about in our societies the kind of transformative changes that will help us overthrow, or that will equip us with the things that can help us overthrow the colonial masters. And this is the mood that Gandhi finds amongst Indians living in England at the time, and certainly the mood in a lot of the sort of urban centers in India. And while Gandhi is very sort of moved by these ideas, he is also unable to accept them so vehemently that on his ship journey back from England to South Africa, he basically writes Hind Swaraj. I think the story goes, like when his hand would get tired, right hand, he would switch to his left hand and start writing with that. He was just so moved by what he had to say. And he shapes the discussion, as I'm sure all of you who read, which I know all of you did, he shapes the discussion as a discussion between an editor and a reader. But the reader, in this case, or the personality of the reader in this case, is the personality of these people. These people who are saying, let's beat the British with the very tools that the Japanese beat the British. And it is precisely on this question of means. What are the means that the revolutionaries are willing to use, that they are completely inattentive to, or impervious to, or the ethical importance of those means? That is where Gandhi points his critique. Because he says that those means that we use are not unimportant. You will become the very thing you use. And you should ask yourself, Gandhi is effectively asking the reader in the shape of the editor, whether the means you want to use are the means that you want to become yourself. So that's kind of like the sort of the background for the text so far. Any questions at this point?
I have a comment, but
Oh, okay.
so Japan wasn't colonized in the traditional way all the other countries were colonized. They were kind of had their own little self-rule in a certain sense. And in 1864, 63, America came by and said, hey, listen, we're going to have really good trade relations, or we're going to bomb the snot out of you, and we're going to give you like high-tech equipment and all this stuff. So Japan was actually a very modern, sort of very technologically advanced country in the late 19th, early 20th century. So they weren't like traditionally the way colonialism worked everywhere else. And Russia at that time was sort of run incompetently. And people on the inside of that little event sort of knew that Japan kind of had the upper hand because it was their ground and their turf and they had better logistics. And Russia was becoming unstable, and they, to such an extent that Tolstoy was almost shot in the face. And Dostoevsky was almost shot in the face, and Tolstoy was on the Tsar's big no-no naughty list. So Russia was sort of on the decline. And then they had the Soviet Revolution and such. So it was just sort of funny to me when you said Russia was this great European power. They were getting kind of sick in the little parts. It's weird from the future perspective, looking back on that. It's really strange.
I know Mercedes, you have a question. So I think these two folks have a comment, I
I
think.
have a comment.
You have a comment too on this? Okay, go ahead.
I guess my comment on Gandhi's mentioned that the means are important.
No, I just want to talk about the Russian thing, I think. Just give me one
No,
minute.
no, it is
Okay,
on
okay,
that.
all right,
So
okay,
the
go on.
means that you become are important is because within the context, I don't suppose you could have known this immediately after the event, but Japan did effectively become another imperialized power because immediately after that, they started expanding their empire through China.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you go and ask South Koreans how they feel about Japan, if you ask people in China who were part of the Japanese Manchuria, any survivors, how they feel about Japan, I think their feelings won't be like, oh, we're cool. I think they would be like, as you are indicating or hinting at, they are quite upset. So that's the nature of Japanese rule. And so Gandhi maybe turned out to be right, that the means that the Japanese use in that moment do not leave them unaffected. Andrew and then Belly.
Do you have a comment?
No, you go ahead first.
No, I had a question, so.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I think that what's important about the Russo-Japanese War isn't necessarily something like analytical from that kind of perspective. I think that what's important from it is the perceptions that it shattered specifically. While Russia might have been, or while Japan might have had the upper hand, it was the perceptions that ended up playing the key role, especially in the rising political scene that was slowly being developed in the Western world upon the general populace, to where it created that sort of mass hysteria about race relations.
Right, absolutely. Like, I think it is the transformation of that perception that is key here, and there's also sort of the thing that gets people excited in the colonies that actually are colonies about what that means. Because while Japan may not have been officially colonized, there was no sort of question that they were considered in the sort of the racial hierarchy that the Europeans had used to justify their rule. They were considered below the Europeans. And so therefore, if they are below, then everybody else who's below can also potentially at least climb up a couple of rungs, if not all the way to the top. Yes, Andy, what's your question?
I was just gonna ask, because you talked about earlier the influence Gandhi had on, Martin Luther King and stuff like that. Did his writings influence his contemporaries in other anti-colonialist movements at the time? Because I was reading excerpts from this book earlier this year called Underground Asia,
Right.
which was about M.N. Roy and all these other anti-colonialist revolutionaries, but they were all related to in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and not to, let's say, Gandhi. So did he have any sort of influence on other anti-colonialist movements at the time, or did that come after India was independent?
That's a good question. I think I don't think she's related, but I'm pretty sure she's not related, but there is a scholar named Leela Gandhi.
Mhm.
She has a book on this.
Oh, okay.
That might be interesting. I think Gandhi was sort of. There are some problems with what he says that we'll get to later, but I think one of them is, for example, he has this whole correspondence with the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, who really, really liked him, but who was upset at Gandhi, at Gandhi's suggestion that the German and European Jews should practice satyagraha against the Nazis. Well, so, it's an interesting question. My first response is also Shah. That doesn't make any sense. And that was Buber's response. Buber was very angry at Gandhi was suggesting that. But Gandhi's logic, we can talk about it later, but Gandhi's logic would have been 6 million people died. Definitely a lot of people would have died if they had practiced satyagraha against the Nazis, but maybe not as many, because maybe the moral transformation in Germans may have occurred.
Yeah, because the impression I got from at least the excerpts of that book, I haven't read the full thing yet, is it's talking about Ho Chi Minh, and there's
Right.
some Indonesian revolutionaries, and all their stuff was very much related to they're directly inspired by Lenin and stuff like that. But his whole thing was, it's going to happen in Europe and not Asia. That's not on the table. But they did not seem to take into account Gandhi or other kind of, I don't know if liberal is the right term, but other kind of nationalist post-colonial figures. They didn't think about him at all. So I don't know if he had any connection.
I think in some ways, Ghana might have been sort of somewhat influenced by him, but certainly, amongst his contemporaries, but he died in 48.
Yeah.
That was one of the earliest India was one of the earliest countries to gain independence, so it's kind of hard to say in terms of what that would have meant, but he certainly was involved in other, read the book by heart, it's a good book. Did you have it, Marion? Did you have your hand up? No, okay, all right, so the reader of the text is arguing in this fashion, is saying, this is what we need to do, we need to have the mechanisms of the British used to gain international ascendancy, that they then used to extract resources out of India, we need to grasp them and make them our own, so as to gain, and here's the word, Swaraj. We need to gain Swaraj. And so the Gandhi, or the editor, which effectively Gandhi is the editor in this case, but the editor asks the reader, says, tell me, what is your understanding of Swaraj? How do you understand self-rule? And so on page 26, the reader says, because India has become impoverished by their government, they take away our money from year to year. The most important posts are reserved for themselves. We are kept in a state of slavery. They behave insolently towards us and disregard our feelings. In other words, what he wants is, what the reader or these revolutionaries imagine independence to be, is that India gets to keep its own money. It is not living in a colonial, state of colonial bondage towards the colonial masters, where the colonial masters will take all the resources out from India into England. The Indians get to keep their money, Indians get to have their own offices, hold their own positions. So, the president of India is an Indian, or the prime minister is an Indian, or the chief minister is an Indian, the finance minister is an Indian, as opposed to a British person. And Indians have a degree of self-respect. They're able to walk around and their feelings are not disregarded. That, the reader or the revolutionary says, is what freedom is. The ability to live lives of self-respect. And here, Gandhi sort of makes a very important point. And I think one of the most beautiful lines in this text come on page 27. Or rather, just to set up the lines, just at the bottom of 26, the reader says, we will get Swaraj when we have arms and ammunition, even as they have. But when we have the same powers, we shall hoist our own flag. As is Japan, so must India be. We must own our navy, our army, and if there had been an air force, I guess our air force and space force, I suppose. And we must have our own splendor. And then will India's voice ring through the world. That's what independence is. And this is the part where Gandhi says beautifully. He says, you have well drawn the picture. In effect, it means this, that we want the English rule without the Englishman. You want the tiger's nature, but not the tiger. That is to say, you would make India English, and when it becomes English, it will not be called Hindustan, which is one name for India, but Englistan. This is not the Swaraj I want. So you want English rule without the English. Gandhi's critique of imperialism is different from the reader. The reader understands imperialism as the forcible extraction of resources in order to feed the British economy, the preservation of a political structure that smooths the process of resource extraction and transfer of resources from one country to another, a political structure that does so, that smooths this process by reserving political power solely in the hands of the British, that denies the Indians any sense of their self-respect. If this is imperialism, then independence, according to the revolutionary, is get guns, get ammunition, get your own flag, kick out the British. Use their economic structure, but use it to benefit India as opposed to the British. That's what we should do. Now, Gandhi says, to do that, if that's your definition of imperialism, then you've misunderstood the problem, because your solution is to simply reproduce the existing British structure and just swap out people who are white-skinned and put brown-skinned people instead. According to your definition, Gandhi says to the reader, or the editor says to the reader, we would have independence. But this, he says, is not the independence I want. Because you've fundamentally misunderstood what imperialism is. Imperialism, Gandhi says, is not only about the forcible extraction of resources, not only about the sense of humiliation you feel, but rather these things are possible because something else has happened. You, or we, as a society, have become enslaved to the idea of what the British offer us. We have bought that hook, line, and sinker. And because we have bought that hook, line, and sinker, we have basically accepted their understanding, the British understanding, of what is good for us. What is good for us, according to the British, is the things that the British offer. And we basically have accepted that. In other words, the British have colonized our minds. They've set the parameters within which we can think of freedom. And what's even worse is, we will congratulate ourselves if we manage to do this, managed to gain the reader's understanding of freedom, we will congratulate ourselves that not only are we free, but we're also civilized. Forgetting all along that the very framework of what is civilized and what is free has been determined not by us, according to our own values, but by the values of the British. And that, he says, is a problem. We need to, he says in effect, redefine what self-rule means. What would it mean to not have the tiger's nature? What would it mean to actually have a Hindustan, as he says? He says on page 71, and we can sort of work our way back to this. I know this is kind of going beyond the reading that we have for Monday or today, but we'll get back to this again on Monday. He says, it is Swaraj, it is self-rule, he says on page 71, when we learn to rule ourselves. When we learn to rule ourselves, that is when we're free. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be able to rule ourselves? If you were to follow the British model of self-rule, you would say, well, you are ruling the self when you are ruled by representatives that you have freely chosen. When you're living under a parliament, or Congress, if you want to use that expression, House of Representatives, when you're living under a parliament that has elected leaders that you've chosen. And Gandhi, frankly, I don't know if you guys read this, but he uses fairly sexist language to describe parliament. Do you guys even catch that?
Yeah.
What did he say?
He calls, what was it? Something about prostitute.
Yep.
And I can't remember it verbatim. I just remember thinking, oh, geez.
I know, right? It was quite, trying to find the exact,
It's on page 30 of mine.
thing.
30, yeah.
Yeah.
Read the passage to us?
It says, all of it.
Well, the part that you think is important.
It says that which you consider to be the mother of parliaments is like a sterile woman and a prostitute. Both of these are harsh terms, but exactly fit the case. That parliament has not yet of its own accord done a single good thing, hence I have compared it to a sterile woman. The natural condition of that parliament is such that without outside pressure, it can do nothing. It is like a prostitute because it is under the control of ministers who change from time to time.
Right. Pretty harsh language. I mean, it's sexist language, certainly, but pretty harsh. In effect, he's saying, as I think the passage is self-explanatory, thank you, Maria, he's saying that parliaments are places for endless debate about stuff that doesn't actually transform into any meaningful action. It doesn't give birth to anything new. It merely regulates what people can and cannot do. But also, more importantly, it is simply a reflection of the interests of whoever is elected to power at that moment and who that person has been funded by. I mean, on this latter, I don't know what you feel about the first point, but on the latter point, you have to certainly agree that even our political system, for the most part, most of the time, is a mere reflection of the various interests that are working in the background to fund this or that political candidate. Any large piece of legislation that you think is going to transform America is immediately, do I dare use the expression, strangled in its crib by armies of lobbyists who descend upon Congress to become active shapers of the legislation in ways that makes it utterly toothless or makes the change so incremental as to not ever really be transformative. And of course, the expression Congress is broken, which people throw around all the time, because it's a do-nothing Congress. In those respects, what Gandhi is saying about the British Parliament, or the parliamentary system more generally, or the system of representative government at large, I think we may not agree with it, but it's hard to dismiss as mere hyperbole, simply because he uses, admittedly, very sexist language to frame this up. Right? No? No, I said, he made noise.
That he was justified in using it?
No, the point that he's making.
Yeah.
Overall, makes sense. Okay, all right. So England, he says, well, the funny thing, this is the part where I think Gandhi is so important. What Gandhi does is, he says, look, the thing that you're misunderstanding about the British, the whole reason why you want to do what you think you want to do, is because you think that what the British have done is actually good. You have bought their argument that they are civilized. You have bought their claims that they've made it for themselves and accepted them as true, and now you're simply trying to figure out how to get to where they are. They have set the goalposts for you, for your imagination. That's why your bondage to the British is much deeper than just the mere fact that they happen to control the system of government. They happen to control your imagination as well. Specifically, you have bought their idea of a modern civilization, of what you'll get out of Britain is a modern civilization. So on page 34, he says, that what you are taking to be the achievement of the British is merely the ability of the modern civilization that they've created to give the people it benefits a sense of bodily welfare. Let's clarify. He says, let us first consider what state of things is described by the word civilization. Its true test lies in the fact that people living in it make bodily welfare the object of life. So he gives examples. He says, long trousers, boots, steam engines that are able to sort of plow vast tracts of land, trains, motor cars, delicately sort of dished up dishes. This is civilization, according to this model of bodily welfare, of the convenience that modern civilization offers. We've called that civilization, but what it merely is that it's made our life easier. He says, but consider the obverse of it. Consider the obvious cost of this model of civilization, this model of expediency, which we, or the British, have basically made their mantra, or the Americans have made their mantra for that matter. He says, formerly, men worked in the open air, only so much as they liked. Now, thousands of workmen meet together and for the sake of maintenance work in factories or mines. Their condition is worse than that of beasts. They're obliged to work at the risk of their lives at most dangerous occupations for the sake of millionaires. Formerly, men were made slaves under physical compulsion. Now, they're enslaved by temptation of money and of the luxuries that money can buy. There are now diseases, coronavirus, of which people never dreamt before, and an army of doctors is engaged in finding out their cures. And so hospitals have increased. This is a test of civilization. And on and on and on and on it goes. Until he said, okay, until he says, this civilization is irreligion. And it has taken such a hold on the people in Europe that those who are in it appear to be half mad. Civilization has become the opposite of whatever Gandhi thinks religion is. It's become the antithesis of that. It has driven people mad. This, he asks, is the thing that you want for India? This is the world that you want to create? Now connect this, if you will, just for a moment, and Mercedes, I'll come to you in just one moment. Connect this to what Marx says. Right? Because Marx would be against Gandhi on this. Marx would say, yeah, terrible things have happened. But ultimately, historically, it was for the good. For the Indians. The old systems have been destroyed, old systems of superstition and religious dogma have been pushed aside, and now everybody can become part of the global proletarian revolution that will lift everybody up and make everybody's lives better. And Gandhi says, I don't want that better life. I don't want the better life for myself. I don't want the better life for Indians. Because that's not what civilization is. Mercedes.
I guess I just had a question that like he sees what he said about hospitals, he says the hospitals are a symptom of the problem, or like new problems that hadn't existed before.
Yeah.
I was just wanting to clarify that.
Yeah. But I feel like you don't agree with that.
No.
I know you do. Tell us why.
I don't agree with it because medical history, I understand where it comes from because largely medical history, and I would argue this is still true now, is that it's largely a process of one step back, one step forward, and two steps back. So there's lots of times when medical treatments are actively hurting you instead of helping you. But I think that discovering new things, and there's lots of diseases and stuff that just because they simply weren't understood doesn't mean they weren't there and they didn't affect you. And I just don't agree with, I do agree with like the modern idea of the hospital. It's only really possible under this system. But the idea that there's medical treatments and the idea that there's places where the sick go is not nearly, it is not only an idea that has been born under imperialism or colonialism. I mean, you can look in Indian history and you can look at thousands of years before that.
Sure.
I just don't agree with that specific analysis.
Okay, I know, but I think, but I'm going to be Gandhi for a second. I'm going to say, no, I'm going to try and persuade you on that. No, Gandhi would be much softer than I can possibly be. So I will let these two fine people take up the mantle. Andrew.
Well, I was going to have a different comment, but to that point, I'm not sure he's strictly arguing against the concept of hospitals, but to the point about diseases, I mean, to use like a modern example besides coronavirus, the whole trend with, I guess, virologists is the word. I don't know the actual technical term for like people who study diseases, is that like,
Epidemiologist.
yeah, thank you, is like biotics and drugs and animal, oh my God, factory farming has created the conditions for essentially new super diseases to spread because the intermingling of all these animals means that bacteria is mixing and stuff like that. And it's, you know, since we use so many antibiotics and all these drugs, is that diseases are more resistant to these drugs. So we're essentially just creating the conditions for like super diseases to just spread across the world and new pandemics and stuff like that. So that can be kind of a symptom of the modernity or civilization he's criticizing, because what I was going to say is this basically just sounds identical in certain respects to the arguments Qutb and I guess Arendt in that book we read was making. They just sound almost the exact same.
Kind of. Except, I think there's a way in which when I was reading Qutb, I remember writing in my notes, oh my God, this sounds like Gandhi. So there's some place that Gandhi gets off in a very crucial way that I think separates him from someone like, definitely from a Qutb, but from an Arendt. But the critique of modernity certainly is true. That the things that you think you're solving are in need of solving for two reasons. One, they've been created again and again by the very mechanisms that are supposed to solve things, but also because you have made bodily welfare your chief goal. We need hospitals. We need the kind of medical care we have available to us today. And this is a very harsh thing to say. And by golly gee, I will be the first one to run to the hospital if me or my daughter gets sick or my wife gets sick. We're going. This is not a personal failure. But Gandhi would say you've forgotten the most important thing, one of the most important things you must do as a human being, which is you have to learn how to die. And the unwillingness to die, the unwillingness to prolong life, to make stuff just absorb it and suck it dry, makes you impervious to all the different ways in which your choice to do so impacts the world.
That's what I was kind of trying to say is like the whole thing with Arendt in that book is she says we've lost like common meaning and we have no sense of the transcendent or the eternal. It's all like, I guess, bodily welfare is the term. So to me, that just seems really similar in the fact that, like, you know, you say we haven't really learned how to die, is that it's the condition of modernity, basically all common meanings have been lost and it's just all focused on present comfort or convenience, I guess.
Right.
I was just going to kind of add on to what Andrew said. When I first read this passage, I kind of thought of it in like a modern sense of how I think Gandhi would look at our healthcare system today.
Sure.
That he would, or at least my impression is that he would think of it in terms of the capitalization of the healthcare system, in that, you know, oftentimes you go to a doctor and then they refer you out to another specialist, to another specialist, to another specialist, ultimately essentially just creating an economic system to end up just getting prescribed some Tylenol at the end of the day, or something like that. Like to where it's become more of a monetary what's the word? Incentive, thank you. Than it is like a healthcare incentive. And then I also see Andrew's point about similarities between Qutb and Gandhi, but I think that Qutb would be more of the reader in Hind Swaraj than like the editor kind of position. Like I think that Qutb is a little bit more aligned to that
Right.
perspective.
Well, so that raises an important point that I do want to mention. I don't have the ability to reproduce for us in the context of a conversation something I think that is a very crucial part of the Gandhian method. The way in which, the generosity with which the editor engages the reader, right? The reader comes off as like aggressive and gruff or whatever. And the editor is like, you have well put this idea. And I can well understand, but for my part, I cannot do this. And there's a certain sort of cleverness politically in terms of sort of not meeting your opponent as two rams sort of butting heads, but rather in a sort of in an inviting posture that is part of the Gandhian ethos. Because the word truth is crucial for Gandhi. This part of the word sat, it refers to being, God, or whatever. Gandhi at one point said, truth is God. When asked what is his vision of God, truth is God. The trouble with being aggressive is that you lose sight of truth. Your investment in winning the point blinds you to the subtleties and nuances of the truth. And so being alert to them is to be religious. Civilization, he says, is irreligious. It becomes irreligious. Civilization becomes irreligious because it also loses sight of the truth. That bodily welfare is not the basis of civilization. All right. Other than that.
I think Brian was before me.
No, go ahead.
That's confusing. That doesn't make sense to me, to assert like that healthcare or like you were saying, like prolonging life, yes, is like capitalization, or that's like society telling you, or bodily welfare, that's society telling you that's a priority or that's important. I feel like it's not necessarily outside factors that make you think that you need to prolong your life. I feel like it's more like a biological, like self-preservation kind of thing for you to prolong your life and try to live longer. So bodily welfare is what is always going to get the priority, if that makes sense. I don't understand the assertion that it's like an illusion.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Mercedes?
I agree that like the desire to live isn't, it isn't shaped, like it's not created. I would say that it's innate and it's not learned or anything. But I would also argue that his view on whether like truth is religion, I guess I would argue that at least through most religions, they're largely shaped on your approach to death and how you come to understand, how you basically come to terms that you are destined to die. And when you live in a society that, largely through capitalism, you separate society like capitalism and religion. When you lose the religious aspect, and you lose the sight of truth, you're ignoring the fact that, you're going to die, and it's one of those things that's like religion is completely addresses that, and that's why it exists, and that a lot of these systems exist in ignorance of that fact.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Gandhi may not mean to say this, but he proposes a sort of, in my mind, a false dichotomy of we can either have modern technology with the British, or we can have self-rule and be less technologically advanced. I don't agree with that analysis. I think you can have both. You can be you can actually rule, India can rule itself and also have access to the highly modern technology of the modern world. I don't think those two things are the same thing. And I think he proposes a false dichotomy there. He may not mean to, but in my mind, and I talked about this elsewhere, when we talked about neoliberalism, a lot of the proponents of neoliberalism would say, well, you either can like what we're doing or you can live in the Soviet Union, which to me is a false argument because there are a lot of other countries that rule themselves and do unaligned movements or people that or governments that engage in sort of civil religious activism say, actually, you're not going to like price gouge people out of their medical bills. We can have a modern society and have a modern conscience.
Let's, so, well, I'll leave you with this thought. To think this to this problem. Because Gandhi, I think for his part, the dude would actually, he found some weird quack. He used to call himself a quack. He said, I'm a quack. I'm going to call himself quack. He found some weird quack in the 19th century, whose books he read, who recommended mud baths. You have pneumonia, pack yourself in wet mud. You have dysentery, pack yourself in wet mud. People were like, dude, you're crazy. Go to the doctor. Heal yourself. Gandhi one time had to forcibly be made to have surgery because he refused to do something that very simple surgery, made his life a lot better. The dude was, on that point, he was putting his money where his mouth was. Whether he should have been putting his money there is a different story. But let's think of it a different way. Our society is premised on the idea of growth. But growth comes at tremendous economic cost. Tremendous. So while Patrick, and I understand what you did, I do it all the time, I used to do it when I was in college as well. While Patrick and I imagine you as well, at some point in order to save money, have bought frozen dinners that were cheaper than buying fresh vegetables and cooking them and sort of making a nice healthy meal. We have basically said, look, the economic cost of this plastic, all the wrapping that goes with it, all the transportation, the freezing, and all the other stuff that goes into this, which is not really reflected in the price, I'm okay with that. We have, in some ways, made our bodily welfare more important than the cost. But the cost is paid somewhere down the line. And Gandhi is saying, I would much rather not have growth. I would much rather starve. I'm not asking you to starve. Please don't starve. I'm glad you didn't. But I would much rather starve than pay a price later in my conscience or later on. And modern civilization presents you with all these goods, but doesn't show you the real price. Focus on the price. The reader is not focused on the price. He's focused on the goods. Gandhi is saying, imagine a world without growth, for example. Imagine a world where the price is real. Okay, with that, let's meet on Monday, and we'll continue with Gandhi. Until then, adios.